The murky quicksand bubbled and shifted as the wild mustang struggled to keep its nostrils above the surface. Only its head remained visible, its dark brown eyes wide with terror, its once proud neck straining upward in a desperate fight for life. The forest stood silent around this grim scene, indifferent to the suffering unfolding beneath the canopy of ancient pines. Mason Reeves had been tracking mountain lion movements that morning when he heard it, not quite a whinny, more like a strangled breath, an animal at the end of its strength. His heart nearly stopped when he pushed through the thick underbrush and saw what waited in the small clearing ahead. The horse was sinking, its movements now weak and sporadic. Mason could see the resignation beginning to settle in its eyes. That terrible moment when a wild creature realizes the fight is lost. Mud coated its muzzle, caking around flared nostrils that struggled to draw breath. This was no ordinary mustang, even covered in filth and exhaustion. Mason could see the powerful lines of its face, the intelligent depth in its gaze. Something about this animal spoke of greatness fallen, of dignity nearly extinguished, but still flickering. Mason moved without hesitation, uncoiling the rope from his pack. The mustang's eyes tracked him, not with hope, but with the weariness of a wild creature that expected only further suffering from human hands. The quicksand made sickening sounds as it pulled at its victim, nature's patient hunter claiming another prize. Mason fashioned a loop, knowing he had one chance to get this right. If the horse panicked further, it would only sink faster. The lasso settled perfectly around the mustang's neck. Mason planted his boots firmly against the solid ground and began to pull. The earth itself seemed to resist, unwilling to surrender its prey. Sweat poured down Mason's face, his skin flushing crimson with effort as he strained against the powerful suction. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, his muscles screaming in protest. But something kept him fighting. Perhaps the way the horse had gone still, as if understanding this was its last chance. With each heave of the rope, Mason uncovered more of the horse. First the neck, then powerful shoulders caked in drying mud. He could feel something shift in the battle, the mustang now working with him rather than against him. As he pulled with renewed strength, Mason noticed something beneath the layers of filth. A marking on the horse's shoulder, partially obscured but unmistakably deliberate. This was no ordinary wild mustang. This animal carried a secret, one that someone had tried to bury forever in this remote death trap of mud and forgotten wilderness. The rope burned through Mason's calloused hands as he pulled with every ounce of strength his body possessed. The quicksand fought back with merciless determination, a hungry mouth, unwilling to surrender its prize. Mason planted his boots against a nearby tree trunk, using it as leverage, his muscles screaming in protest as sweat poured down his face. His skin grew redder with each desperate heave, his breath coming in ragged gasps that echoed through the silent forest. The wild mustang's eyes never left him, watching with a mixture of primal fear and fading acceptance, as if understanding that this human represented either salvation or one final betrayal before death claimed its due. Hours passed, like heartbeats in this brutal tug of war against nature. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows across the grim tableau of man versus earth. With each pull, Mason revealed more of the horse's body, first the neck, then powerful shoulders caked in mud. The mustang no longer struggled, its energy reserves depleted, survival now entirely dependent on this stranger's determination. Several times Mason's grip slipped, sending him crashing backward, but each time he scrambled to his feet, seized the rope again, refusing to surrender this magnificent creature to the earth's cold embrace. The mustang's breathing grew more labored, its eyes beginning to glaze with exhaustion. Mason could see death hovering at the edges of this clearing, patient and inevitable. He adjusted his stance, wrapping the rope around his torso, using his entire body as an anchor. Pain shot through his lower back. His shoulders threatened to dislocate, but something deeper than reason drove him forward. With a roar that startled birds from nearby trees, Mason summoned strength he didn't know he possessed, pulling with such force that veins bulged at his temples. The earth released its grip with reluctant surrender. First the horse's chest emerged, then its forelegs, giving it leverage to help in its own rescue. Mason didn't relent, continuing to pull until finally, with a sickening squelch, the Mustang's hindquarters broke free. The magnificent animal collapsed on solid ground, its sides heaving, its once gleaming coat now a uniform muddy brown. Only then did Mason allow himself to drop to his knees, his entire body trembling with fatigue. As darkness began to claim the forest, Mason studied the exhausted animal. Its breath came in shallow gasps, yet there was something in its gaze, a quiet dignity that transcended its current state. Mason traced his fingers along the horse's neck, brushing away layers of dried mud, revealing something that made his pulse quicken. There, partially hidden beneath the filth, was a brand, not the typical mark of ownership, but something far more significant, something that would change everything Mason thought he knew about this supposed wild Mustang. The brand emerged from beneath the layers of dried mud, like a ghost from another life, its clean lines unmistakable, even under the grime of wilderness and despair. Mason's fingers trembled as he traced the familiar symbol, a crescent moon intersecting with a stylized W, the mark of Westridge Stables. His breath caught in his throat, memories rushing back like floodwaters breaking through a dam. This wasn't some anonymous wild Mustang that had wandered into Quicksand. This was a horse with a history, a past connected to the most prestigious racing operation in 3 states, a past connected to Mason's own. The exhausted animal lay on its side, ribs heaving with each labored breath, its once powerful frame now showing signs of neglect and hardship. Mason sat back on his heels, mind racing as he processed what this discovery meant. Westridge horses were worth fortunes, treated better than royalty, guarded like crown jewels. Their champions lived in climate-controlled stables with round-the-clock care, their lineages tracked for generations. They didn't end up half dead in remote wilderness Quicksand, abandoned and forgotten. Mason's past flashed before him, in fragments. The years he'd spent working at Westridge as a young trainer before everything fell apart. He remembered the opulence, the gleaming trophies in glass cases, the hush of respect that fell over visitors touring the immaculate grounds. But he also remembered the whispers, the closed-door meetings, the horses that disappeared after underperforming. Owner Jonathan Westridge's smile never quite reached his cold eyes, especially when profit margins were discussed. The horse's eyes fluttered open, meeting Mason's gaze with an intelligence that transcended species. There was recognition there, not of Mason specifically, but of human intention. This animal had known both kindness and cruelty from human hands. Its muscles tensed slightly, prepared for either. Mason gently stroked its mud-caked neck, murmuring reassurances. The branded mark seemed to burn beneath his fingertips, a puzzle piece that changed everything. Night was falling fast, the forest darkening around them. The horse needed shelter, water, care. Its rescue from Quicksand was just the beginning of a longer journey. Mason gathered his strength, knowing he couldn't leave this animal here. Whatever story this horse carried in its bones, whatever events had led it from the manicured pastures of Westridge to this wilderness deathbed, Mason was now part of that narrative. He gathered the loose end of the rope, gently encouraging the horse to rise. As the Mustang struggled to its feet, swaying with exhaustion, Mason saw something else beneath the mud. Scars, deliberate and cruel, speaking of systematic abuse rather than wild living. His jaw tightened. The prestigious Westridge Stables had secrets, and somehow this suffering animal was the key to uncovering them. Whatever it took, Mason would find the truth. The truth emerged from beneath the caked mud and filth like a ghost returning from the grave. Each stroke of the brush revealing more of a story that should never have come to light. Mason worked methodically in the dim light of his cabin, washing away layers of wilderness and neglect from the horse's trembling frame. The water in the bucket turned dark with grime, But it wasn't the dirt that made Mason's hands freeze mid-motion. It was the distinctive white blaze running down the stallion's forehead, the precise pattern of the left hind ankle marking, details that matched only one horse, Thunderbolt, the three-time Derby winner, reported dead in a tragic stable fire 2 years ago. A champion worth millions whose insurance payout had made headlines across the racing world. Mason stepped back, his breath catching in his throat as the impossible reality settled over him like a physical weight. Thunderbolt had been racing royalty, his bloodline traced back through generations of champions, his speed almost supernatural on the track. Now this living ghost stood before him, ribs protruding sharply against dull hide, eyes hollow with suffering, legs bearing scars that spoke of deliberate cruelty rather than accident. A horse that had once commanded the attention of thousands now struggled to stand, his proud spirit nearly extinguished by whatever dark journey had brought him to that quicksand grave. The official story flashed through Mason's mind: the tragic nighttime fire, the heroic but failed attempt to rescue the prized stallion, the solemn press conference where Westridge Stables owner Jonathan Westridge had nearly shed tears over the loss. Insurance investigators had confirmed the death, a closed casket of sorts for a champion whose remains were supposedly too charred for public viewing. Yet here stood the deceased, breathing labored breaths in Mason's humble cabin, very much alive but bearing the marks of something far worse than fire. Mason's fingers traced the newer scars across Thunderbolt's flanks, methodical marks that could only have been made by human hands with deliberate intent. The horse flinched at his touch, but didn't pull away, as if too exhausted for fear. Something sinister lurked behind this resurrection, something powerful enough to fake a champion's death, collect millions in insurance, and then subject the animal to systematic abuse before attempting to erase all evidence in the unforgiving wilderness. Night pressed against the cabin windows as Mason continued his examination, each discovery adding to the grim picture forming in his mind. Injection marks dotted the horse's neck, speaking of drugs administered by someone with veterinary knowledge. The uneven wear of the hooves suggested confined quarters, not the open ranges where wild mustangs roamed. Every detail pointed to a carefully orchestrated deception that had nearly succeeded, a secret that powerful men had tried to bury forever in that quicksand. Mason stepped back, meeting Thunderbolt's gaze. The eyes that had once blazed with competitive fire now held a weariness born of betrayal. Yet something else flickered there too, a recognition perhaps, that this human represented something different from those who had orchestrated his fall from grace. The financial records lay spread across Mason's kitchen table like puzzle pieces from different boxes, each document revealing fragments of a truth too monstrous to comprehend in its entirety. Mason had spent days gathering these scraps of evidence: insurance claims with suspiciously round numbers, veterinary reports with inconsistent details, and newspaper clippings announcing Thunderbolt's tragic death in a stable fire. The paper trail painted a picture of calculated deception, of a champion racehorse worth more dead than alive to the man who supposedly cherished him. Victor Harrington, owner of Westridge Stables, had collected $7 million in insurance money for a horse that now stood in Mason's barn, breathing, suffering, but undeniably alive. The deeper Mason dug, the darker the shadows became. Former stable hands spoke in hushed tones about Victor's mounting gambling debts, about races that should have been won but mysteriously weren't. They mentioned horses that disappeared after underperforming, official reports that never matched whispered truths. One former employee, eyes darting nervously as if Victor might materialize from thin air, described how Thunderbolt had become increasingly agitated around Victor in the weeks before the supposed fire. The champion stallion, known for his even temperament, would rear and thrash whenever the stable owner approached his stall. Mason traced his finger along the timeline he'd constructed on a worn notebook page. The stable fire had occurred just 3 days after Victor had entertained potential buyers from overseas, investors looking for a champion to breed rather than race. Something had gone wrong during that meeting. Perhaps an unexpected medical exam had revealed performance-enhancing drugs, or maybe the foreign buyers had offered less than what insurance would pay for a tragic accident. Either way, Thunderbolt had become more valuable as a tragedy than as a living champion. The most damning evidence came from a night security guard who'd been fired shortly after the fire. He claimed to have seen Victor leading a horse matching Thunderbolt's description away from the stables hours before the flames erupted. The official investigation had dismissed his testimony, citing the man's history of alcohol abuse. The guard had died 6 months later in a single-vehicle accident on a deserted road, another loose end neatly tied. Mason sat back, rubbing his tired eyes, as dawn light filtered through the cabin windows. In the adjacent barn, Thunderbolt shifted restlessly, haunted by memories only he could see. The stallion wasn't just a victim of insurance fraud. He was a witness to something darker, something that had made Victor Harrington desperate enough to fake a champion's death, subject him to systematic abuse, and finally attempt to erase all evidence in remote wilderness quicksand. The question that now burned in Mason's mind wasn't just how to prove what had happened, but what terrible secret made Thunderbolt dangerous enough to kill. The security footage played on Mason's laptop screen in grainy black and white, revealing a truth more sinister than he had dared imagine. The stable's security camera had captured it all. Victor Harrington and his business partner James Whitfield in a heated confrontation that escalated beyond words, beyond reason, beyond return. Mason watched in stunned silence as Victor's rage exploded into violence, his hands finding a pitchfork that entered James's chest with terrible precision. What made the footage even more chilling was the witness, Thunderbolt, standing in his stall directly across from where James Whitfield took his final breath. The horse's ears pricked forward, his intelligent eyes taking in every detail of the murder. In that moment, Mason understood everything. The champion wasn't just an insurance fraud casualty. He was the only witness to a cold-blooded killing. The revelation came through an unexpected source, Victor's former stable manager, Ellen Summers, who had quietly downloaded the security recordings before they mysteriously malfunctioned in the official investigation. Ellen had kept silent, fearing for her own life, but Mason's inquiries about the mysteriously resurrected champion had reached her. The flash drive she had handed him contained not just the murder, but the aftermath. Victor returning later that night staring at Thunderbolt with calculating eyes, the horse agitated in a way that spoke of recognition beyond what humans believed animals capable of. Mason's gaze drifted to the barn where Thunderbolt now rested, his broken body slowly healing under gentle care. The stallion had carried this burden alone, unable to speak the horror he had witnessed. How many nights had the champion stood in his stall, watching Victor approach with smiles for visitors, while the horse alone knew the darkness beneath the man's carefully constructed facade. No wonder Victor had gone to such extremes. A dead horse tells no tales, carries no memories, poses no threat to a murderer's freedom. The sequence following the murder painted a grim picture of calculated evil, rather than risk putting the horse down, which would require a veterinarian's involvement and potential questions. Victor had orchestrated the fake fire, collected the insurance, and then subjected Thunderbolt to months of hidden existence. The final plan had been cruel in its simplicity. Abandon the weakened horse in remote wilderness, where nature would finish what man had begun. No body, no evidence, no witness. The quicksand had almost completed what Victor had started. Mason closed the laptop, his decision already made. The truth could no longer remain buried, just as Thunderbolt had refused to stay dead. The bond between them now transcended rescuer and rescued. They were united by a shared purpose, by the weight of knowledge that demanded justice. In the quiet of the evening, Mason walked to the barn, where Thunderbolt's ears pricked forward at his approach. Those eyes held more than animal awareness. They carried the memory of betrayal, of witnessing humanity at its darkest. Yet still they held trust for this one human, who had pulled him from the earth that had nearly claimed him. The transformation began with a flicker in Thunderbolt's eyes, barely perceptible against the backdrop of fear that had dominated for so long. Mason noticed it one morning, as sunlight streamed through barn windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like memories between them. The horse no longer flinched when Mason approached with grain and fresh water, instead watching with cautious curiosity as gentle hands tended wounds that told stories of betrayal. Trust, that most fragile bridge between souls, was being rebuilt one careful moment at a time. The champion who had once thundered down racetracks before thousands now stood quiet in a humble barn, learning that not all humans carry darkness in their touch. Days melted into weeks as Mason worked with patient determination, his movements always slow, his voice a steady stream of calm reassurance. The physical wounds began to heal first. Ribs no longer protruded so sharply against dull hide. Muscles regained definition beneath Mason's careful grooming, hooves trimmed with respect for the pain they had endured. But the deeper healing, the mending of a spirit nearly broken by human cruelty, required a different kind of medicine altogether. Mason spent hours simply sitting in the stall, reading aloud from dog-eared novels or humming old country songs, allowing Thunderbolt to understand that presence didn't always precede pain. The spring rain brought new grass, and with it, new strength. Mason led Thunderbolt to the small paddock behind the barn, removing the lead rope and stepping back. For long moments the horse stood frozen, as if freedom itself had become a foreign concept. Then, with hesitant steps that grew more confident with each passing second, Thunderbolt moved forward, his nose brushing the fresh green shoots. When he lifted his head, the sun caught something in his gaze, a ghost of the fire that had once made him a champion. Mason's throat tightened at the sight. Their breakthrough came during a thunderstorm that rattled the barn's timbers and sent rain drumming against the roof like impatient hooves. Thunderbolt, trembling at each crack of lightning, pressed his massive body against the stall's corner, eyes wild with remembered terror. Without thinking, Mason entered, placing himself between the horse and the storm. Instead of lashing out in panic, Thunderbolt lowered his proud head until it rested against Mason's shoulder, his breath warm and surprisingly steady. In that moment, something profound passed between them, an understanding beyond words, a promise exchanged in the language of shared breath and steady heartbeats. As summer bloomed across the land, Thunderbolt's stride regained its powerful grace. He would come running when Mason called, no longer a broken refugee, but a survivor, reclaiming his dignity. Sometimes Mason would catch the horse watching him with an intensity that transcended ordinary animal awareness, as if Thunderbolt understood that this human represented not just safety, but the possibility of justice, for wounds that went deeper than flesh. The confrontation unfolded beneath stormy skies, tension crackling in the air like the distant lightning that illuminated Westridge Stable's polished facade. Mason stood at the entrance to Victor Harrington's pristine office, Thunderbolt's lead rope clutched in one hand, a weathered folder containing damning evidence in the other. The horse's presence was an accusation itself, a ghost returned from a fabricated grave, standing proud despite the scars that mapped his suffering. Victor's face drained of color at the sight, his carefully constructed world of wealth and prestige crumbling beneath the steady gaze of the horse who had witnessed his darkest moment. For a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his environment, the unexpected resurrection of his greatest secret struck like a physical blow. Mason placed the security footage on Victor's immaculate desk, the flash drive small, yet devastating in its power. The stable owner's fingers trembled as recognition dawned, his eyes darting between Mason, the evidence, and the living proof of his failed deception. Standing in the doorway, the champion horse's ears flicked forward, his intelligent gaze fixed on the man who had sentenced him to a wilderness death. After years of abuse, something primitive flashed across Victor's features, the cornered predator suddenly understanding it had become prey. Victor's composure fractured like thin ice beneath spring sun, words spilling forth in a desperate attempt to justify the unjustifiable. His confession unfolded in fragments, the business disagreement with James Whitfield that escalated beyond control, the moment of rage that ended with a pitchfork and blood-soaked straw, the cold calculation that followed as he realized the only witness was a horse whose eyes had tracked his every movement. The insurance scheme had been an afterthought, a profitable solution to the problem of a witness who couldn't speak but somehow communicated guilt with every nervous movement whenever Victor approached. What Victor didn't notice, focused as he was on Mason and the ghost horse returned to haunt him, was the small device placed carefully beneath the visitor's chair earlier that morning. Behind the adjacent wall in a room Victor believed empty, Detective Sarah Callahan and 2 officers listened intently, recording every damning word, every inadvertent admission. The case file on James Whitfield's disappearance, never officially closed despite Victor's careful maneuvering, was about to receive its final decisive evidence. Thunderbolt shifted his weight, hooves clicking against the polished floor, a sound that made Victor flinch, as if struck. The horse who had survived quicksand, abuse, and attempted murder now stood as living testimony to a truth that could no longer remain buried. Mason moved his hand to rest on Thunderbolt's neck, feeling the steady pulse beneath his palm. Justice would not bring back James Whitfield, nor erase the scars etched into Thunderbolt's body and spirit. But as footsteps approached from the hallway, it promised something equally powerful: the end of Victor Harrington's freedom and the beginning of accountability. The morning sun bathed the sprawling sanctuary in golden light, illuminating what once seemed impossible. Thunderbolt, the champion given up for dead, now stood tall on the hillside, his coat gleaming with health, his eyes bright with reclaimed dignity. The transformation from the broken creature Mason had pulled from quicksand seemed nothing short of miraculous. Where once had been a skeleton draped in mud-caked hide, now stood a magnificent stallion, muscles rippling beneath a glossy chestnut coat, his powerful neck arched as he surveyed the peaceful kingdom that had become his home. The scars remained, physical reminders of betrayal etched into his flesh, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they told a story of survival against impossible odds, of darkness giving way to dawn. Mason leaned against the weathered fence, watching as Thunderbolt moved with fluid grace among the other rescued horses. The trial had made headlines nationwide. Victor Harrington sentenced to life for the murder of James Whitfield. The fraudulent insurance claim, a footnote to the greater crime. Justice had been served. But for Mason, the true victory lived in the daily miracles unfolding across these 50 acres, now dedicated to horses saved from abuse, neglect, and slaughter. What had begun with one desperate rescue in quicksand had blossomed into purpose, a calling that filled the hollow spaces grief had once carved into his life. Thunderbolt approached the fence with confident steps, nothing like the terrified creature that once flinched at human touch. He pressed his velvet muzzle against Mason's palm, his breath warm and trusting. They had healed each other, man and horse, finding in their unlikely bond something that transcended the cruelty that had nearly destroyed them both. Visitors came from across the country now, drawn by the story of the champion who refused to die, who carried within his powerful heart the capacity for forgiveness that humans rarely achieved. The sanctuary had grown beyond Mason's wildest dreams. 27 horses roamed the pastures, each with their own story of rescue and redemption. Volunteer programs flourished. Educational outreach spread the message of compassion, and donations funded expansion into neighboring land. Thunderbolt remained the beating heart of it all, the living embodiment of the truth Mason shared with every visitor, that no creature is beyond saving when someone cares enough to fight for them, that second chances aren't just possible, but necessary in a world that too easily discards the broken. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the peaceful fields, Thunderbolt galloped with the joyful abandon of a spirit fully reclaimed, his powerful strides carrying him across ground once denied him. In his freedom, Mason found his own. If you've been touched by Thunderbolt's incredible journey from the depths of quicksand to this sanctuary of hope, please like this video and subscribe for more powerful stories of horse rescue and redemption. Thank you for watching, and I'll hope to see you in the next video.